Imagine standing on the open plains of North America, in the middle of winter. The temperature has dropped to 30 below zero. The wind doesn't blow here, it hunts. It tears across the flatlands with nothing to stop it, nothing to slow it down, nothing between you and it, but open sky and frozen ground stretching as far as you can see. In the distance, half buried in drifting snow, stands a single structure. No concrete, no insulation, no electricity. No heating system built by engineers in a warm office somewhere. Just wood, hide, and a shape that has been standing on these plains for thousands of years. And inside that structure, right now, a child is sleeping. Not shivering, not fighting for warmth. Sleeping. Now here's what will stop you cold. NASA engineers once studied the teepee, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. When they were designing systems for extreme environments, they kept coming back to the same structure that Native Americans had perfected centuries before. They found solutions inside a cone of animal hide that modern engineering hadn't thought of yet. So the real question isn't how did these people survive? The real question is, what did they figure out that we forgot? Welcome to Primal Echoes, where we go back to the moments that shaped human survival. Not myths, real engineering, real wisdom, real people who learned to live when the world gave them every reason to die. Stay with me until the end, because by the time this is over, you'll never look at a simple structure the same way again. It starts with a shape, and that shape was never an accident. Let's start with the shape, because the shape is where everything begins. Most people look at a teepee and see a cone. Simple, primitive, almost childlike in its geometry. But what those people are missing is that this shape is not the result of limited thinking. It is the result of perfect thinking. On the Great Plains, there are no mountains, no forests, no natural barriers to slow the wind. The wind here is a force of nature in the truest sense, and anything that stands against it must be built to work with it, not against it. The cone does exactly that. Where a square structure creates resistance and drag, the smooth sloping walls of the tipi let the wind flow around it and slide away, finding nothing to grab. Nothing to push against, nothing to break. And it goes deeper than that. The base of the teepee was not a perfect circle. It was egg-shaped, slightly elongated, with the steeper side facing into the prevailing wind, and the gentler side, where the entrance sat, resting in the aerodynamic shadow behind it. Engineers who design wind turbines and fighter jet cockpits use this same principle today. And the poles themselves, long flexible pine or fir, were not rigid. Under pressure, they bent, absorbed the energy of the gust, and returned, like a spine, like something alive. But the shape was only the beginning. What covered that frame was not simply leather. It was a membrane, engineered over days, sometimes weeks, by the women of the tribe. Between 8 and 20 bison hides went into a single teepee cover, and each one was processed by hand, through a method that modern chemistry would take centuries to fully understand. Fresh hides were scraped clean, stretched flat under the open sky, and then worked with a mixture of the animal's own brain and liver, natural emulsifiers that broke down the dense collagen fibers and transformed a stiff, raw hide into something soft, supple, and almost breathable. After that came smoking. The hide was stretched over a low frame, while slow, smoldering fire filled it with smoke from rotten wood, binding to every fiber, sealing it against moisture, making it resistant to rot and rain in a way no synthetic coating can fully replicate even now. And when the individual hides were finally ready, they were joined together using thread made from animal tendon, soaked, split into fine fibers, twisted tight, and when dry, those seams contracted and sealed themselves almost airtight. Every stitch placed by hand, every hide prepared by someone who knew that the quality of her work would determine whether her family stayed warm or froze. This was not craft. This was not tradition for tradition's sake. This was love, given a technical form, sewn into every seam of a structure built to outlast the worst winter the plains could offer. But here's what you need to understand. That outer skin, as extraordinary as it was only the first line of defense. What truly kept people warm through the coldest nights was something hidden inside. A secret layer that almost no one outside the tribe was ever meant to know about. And that is exactly where we're going next. Now we get to the part that most people never hear about. The part that separates a tipi from every other cold weather shelter ever built by human hands. Because here is the truth. The outer skin, the aerodynamic cone, the smoke-sealed seams, all of it was impressive, but none of it was the real secret. The real secret was a second wall, hidden inside the teepee, hung from the poles at roughly human height, was an inner lining that the Lakota people called the ozan. It was made from thinner, lighter processed hides, and it did not reach the top, and it did not touch the ground. That gap, just 6 to 8 inches of air between the inner lining and the outer cover, was the most important 6 inches in the entire structure. Think about what modern architects call double-glazed windows, 2 panes of glass with a sealed air gap between them, designed to slow the transfer of heat from inside to outside. The ozan worked on exactly that principle. 400 years before double-glazed windows existed anywhere in the world. Cold air that seeped in under the edge of the outer cover did not enter the living space directly. Instead, it entered that narrow air chamber, where it was slowly warmed by the heat radiating from the inner wall, and then it rose, quietly, gradually, toward the top of the structure. This created a constant, gentle circulation that distributed warmth evenly through the interior and prevented the deadly drafts that would have made the space unlivable. But what strikes me most about this design is not the physics, it is the philosophy behind it. The Lakota did not build the ozan because they were fighting the cold. They built it because they understood something that most modern engineers take years of school to learn, that the cold itself could be used, trapped, redirected, turned from an enemy into a tool. They did not resist nature, they recruited it. And at the center of all of this was the fire. But not the fire you are imagining. There were no roaring flames inside a teepee, no chest-high blaze throwing sparks toward the smoke hole. The hearth was small, rarely more than 12 to 16 inches across, and that smallness was entirely intentional. A large fire consumes wood faster, produces more uncontrollable smoke, and creates uneven heat that scorches one side of the room while the other stays cold. A small, intense fire built from dry poplar or willow burned clean and hot, and the stones placed carefully around it absorbed that heat through the day and released it slowly through the night, like a thermal battery that needed no wiring and no maintenance. The position of that hearth mattered too. It sat not at the geometric center of the floor, but slightly offset toward the entrance, a deliberate placement that pulled cold air in from outside, sent it across the flame, and pushed the warmed air toward the back of the space where people slept. The fire didn't just heat the teepee. It drove the entire air circulation system like an engine turning quietly at the heart of a machine. And above it all, at the very top, where the poles converged and the smoke needed to escape, was a system so elegant that modern ventilation engineers still reference its principles. 2 adjustable flaps, extensions of the outer cover, each controlled by its own long pole planted in the ground outside, could be opened, angled, or nearly closed depending on the wind direction and strength. When the air outside was still, they opened wide and let the smoke rise freely. When the wind picked up, the person managing those poles would angle the upwind flap to create a barrier and leave the downwind side open. And what happened next was pure physics. The wind flowing around the cone created a zone of low pressure at the smoke hole, and that low pressure literally pulled the smoke out of the interior. The same Venturi effect that engineers use today to ventilate skyscrapers and underground tunnels. In the middle of a blizzard, with wind screaming across the plains at 40 miles an hour, there was not a trace of smoke inside that teepee. Not a cough, not a watering eye, just clean, warm air and the quiet sound of a fire that knew exactly where it was going. The walls had handled the wind. The inner lining had handled the cold air. The fire and the smoke system had handled heat and breathability. But there was one more threat they had not yet addressed, one that most people forget entirely when they think about surviving winter. The ground itself. Because frozen earth pulls heat from a human body faster than cold air does, and the floor of a teepee was anything but an afterthought. No one who understood winter would sleep on bare frozen ground, and no one in a teepee ever did. The floor beneath a winter camp was not a single surface. It was a system, built in layers, the way a skilled carpenter builds a wall. First, the earth itself was leveled and packed down firm. On top of that went a thick bed of dry grass, fern branches, or reed, materials that trapped air close to the ground and created a cushion between the body and the cold rising from below. Over that came untreated hides, durable and flat, covering the entire living area. And on top of everything, in the places where people actually sat and slept, lay the final layer. Tanned bison robes with the thick fur facing upward, dense and deep enough to sink your fingers into. Sleeping platforms woven from willow rods lifted the bed slightly off the floor, adding one more pocket of still air beneath the body. And the bison robe pulled over you at night. A single one of those robes was enough to keep a person warm at 40 below zero. This was not survival. This was comfort, deliberately engineered from the ground up, in every literal sense. But a single teepee, no matter how perfectly built, was never meant to stand alone. The choice of where to place the winter camp was itself a form of engineering, one that worked with the landscape instead of ignoring it. River valleys were chosen above all else, because the high banks on either side created their own microclimate, calmer and several degrees warmer than the open plains above. Dense groves of poplar and willow lined those valleys, and they served two purposes at once: a natural windbreak that dispersed the force of the coldest gusts, and an endless supply of dry wood within easy reach. Every teepee in the camp faced east, with its entrance turned away from the prevailing north and west winds, and angled toward the morning sun, which reached inside early and began warming the space before the fire even needed tending. And the teepees were not scattered randomly. They were arranged in a great circle, a shape that carried deep spiritual meaning for the people who lived inside it, but also created something engineers would recognize immediately: a collective aerodynamic structure, where each dwelling helped shelter the ones beside it, and the open center of the circle stayed calmer than the wind-scoured ground outside. Then came the final step, the one that turned the enemy itself into armor. Once the tipi was raised and the cover was pegged down, snow was packed against the base all the way around, banked up 2 to 3 feet high in a dense continuous mound. Snow, which most people instinctively fear in extreme cold, is actually one of the finest natural insulators on Earth, because it is mostly air, tiny pockets of stillness trapped between crystals, unable to conduct heat away from the structure it surrounds. That snow wall sealed the gap between the cover and the frozen ground, blocked every last draft that the wind might push underneath, and added a layer of insulation that no amount of additional hide could have matched. They did not fight the winter. They used it, every element of it, down to the very snow that was trying to bury them. Every material in that camp came from the land around it. Every technique came from generations of watching, testing, and remembering. But there was one final source of warmth holding all of it together, one that no amount of engineering, no matter how brilliant, could ever replace on its own. Every system we have talked about, the aerodynamic cone, the double-walled air chamber, the thermal hearth, the smoke valves, the layered floor, the snow wall, every single one of them was built to protect the people inside. But the people inside were not passive. They were, in the end, the final and most important layer of warmth the tipi had. A teepee was never a dwelling for 1 or 2 people. It was a space for a family across generations: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes extended kin, and the combined heat of several bodies breathing and moving in a small interior space contributed more to the temperature than most people realize. But beyond the physics, beyond the biology, there was something else happening in that enclosed circle of warmth on a winter night that no thermometer could ever measure. Winter on the Great Plains was not the dead season. It was the deep season. It was the time when the relentless movement of nomadic life finally slowed and the people turned inward toward each other. Elders sat close to the fire and spoke, not casually, but with intention, passing the stories that held the identity of the tribe, the knowledge of the land, the memory of everything that had to be remembered so it would not be lost. Children listened with the kind of attention that only firelight and darkness can produce. Women worked with their hands, embroidering, weaving, repairing, creating objects of beauty in the middle of a blizzard. Men shaped tools and weapons with quiet focus. The fire at the center of it all was not just heating the air, it was holding the community together, and the warmth it produced was something that went far deeper than temperature. And this is the part that I think we have genuinely lost. We have better insulation now. We have thermostats and triple-pane windows, and radiant floor heating, and every comfort that centuries of engineering have produced. And yet something about the way we live in winter feels hollow in a way that is difficult to name. We are warm in our bodies and cold in our connections. The tipi was not just a shelter. It was a philosophy of living, encoded into a physical structure. The idea that warmth is not something a building provides, but something people create together, for each other, deliberately and with care. Those who lived inside it did not endure the winter. They did not merely survive it. They lived it, fully, warmly, together, in a way that most of us, surrounded by every modern comfort, have quietly forgotten how to do. And maybe that is the technology we actually lost. If that idea stays with you, I would genuinely like to know, what ancient survival system do you think we have forgotten? Leave it in the comments below, because those answers always lead us somewhere worth going. Next on Primal Echoes, we are going further north and further back, into the world of the Viking Longhouse and the Athabascan Winter Shelter, where survival demanded a completely different kind of genius. If you want to be there when that story comes out, subscribe now and make sure you do not miss it. This is Primal Echoes. We will see you in the next one.